My stepfather gave me a sealed envelope on his deathbed and said, "Open this when you're ready to know the truth about your real father." Years later, I finally opened it, and what I found inside changed everything. Hello, my name is Gabriel Morrison. I'm 34 years old, living in Austin, Texas, a city where the music never stops and the summer heat makes you question every life choice. But Austin has this raw energy that matches how I've always felt inside. Restless, searching, never quite fitting into the neat little boxes people try to put you in. I work as a software engineer for a tech startup downtown, the kind of place where everyone drinks kombucha and talks about disrupting industries they barely understand. But the work pays well, and it keeps my mind busy enough that I don't spend too much time thinking about the past. At least, that's what I tell myself. Growing up, I always knew something was different about my family. Not in an obvious way. We looked normal enough from the outside. My mother, Sarah Morrison, was a high school English teacher with kind eyes and a smile that could make you believe everything would work out, even when it wouldn't. She had this way of humming old folk songs while cooking dinner, her voice soft and melodic, filling our small house with warmth. My stepfather, David Morrison, was the only father I ever knew. He was a mechanic who owned a small garage on the outskirts of San Antonio, about an hour south of where I live now. His hands were always stained with motor oil, and he smelled like cigarettes and WD-40. But when he looked at me, there was genuine love in his eyes. He taught me how to change a tire, how to throw a curveball, and how to stand up for myself when the kids at school made fun of my second-hand clothes. But there were moments, brief, fleeting moments, when I'd catch him staring at me with this strange expression. Not sadness exactly, but something deeper, like he was carrying a secret too heavy for his shoulders. When I was younger, I'd ask him about it, but he'd just ruffle my hair and change the subject. "Some things are for when you're older, Gabe," he'd say in that gravelly voice of his. "When you're ready to understand." I had a younger sister, Emma, who was David's biological daughter. She had his dark hair and his stubborn streak, and there was never any question that she belonged. Emma and I were close, but I always felt like I was watching their family from the outside, even though I was technically part of it. The questions about my real father started when I was about 12. Kids at school have a way of sniffing out differences, and somehow they knew I wasn't David's biological son, even though he'd legally adopted me when I was 3. They'd taunt me with cruel questions. "Where's your real dad? Why didn't he want you?" I'd come home with scraped knuckles and a bloody nose, and Mom would patch me up while David paced the kitchen, his jaw clenched tight. "Those kids don't know what they're talking about," he'd mutter. "You're my son, Gabe. That's all that matters." But late at night, when the house was quiet, I'd lie in bed wondering about the man whose DNA I carried. Was he tall like me? Did he have the same green eyes? Did he think about me, wherever he was, or had he forgotten I existed the moment my mother walked away? Mom would deflect my questions with practiced ease. "Your father wasn't ready to be a parent," she'd say, her voice gentle but final. "David is your father in every way that counts." And David was. He never missed a baseball game, never forgot a birthday, never made me feel like I was anything less than his own flesh and blood. But the older I got, the more I noticed the way conversations would stop when I entered a room, the way certain relatives would look at me with pity in their eyes, the way my mother's sister, Aunt Linda, would sometimes slip and say things like, "He has his father's temper," before catching herself and changing the subject. When I turned 18, I finally worked up the courage to ask direct questions. I cornered my mother in the kitchen one Sunday morning, determined to get answers. "Mom, I need to know about my biological father," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm an adult now. I deserve to know." She was washing dishes, her hands moving mechanically under the soapy water. For a long moment, she didn't respond. Then she turned to face me, and I saw tears in her eyes. "Gabriel," she said softly, "some doors are better left unopened. Your father, he wasn't a good man. He hurt people. He hurt me. David saved us both when he married me. Please don't ask me to dig up those memories." The pain in her voice was so raw, so real that I dropped the subject. But the questions never went away. They just burrowed deeper, like splinters working their way to the surface. College was my escape. I threw myself into computer science, spending long nights in the lab writing code until my eyes burned. The logical world of programming made sense to me in a way that family dynamics never did. Variables had clear values, functions had predictable outputs, and bugs could be identified and fixed. I stayed close to home, attending the University of Texas at Austin, partly because of in-state tuition, and partly because I couldn't bring myself to leave Mom and David completely behind. Every few weekends, I'd drive down to San Antonio to help David in the garage and eat Mom's Sunday pot roast. It was during my junior year that David started getting sick. At first, it was just a persistent cough that he blamed on years of smoking. Then came the weight loss, the fatigue, the way he'd have to sit down after walking up a flight of stairs. The diagnosis came in March: lung cancer, stage 3. The doctors gave him 6 months to a year, maybe longer with aggressive treatment. David, being David, opted for quality over quantity. "I'm not spending my last months hooked up to machines," he told us. "I want to live what time I have left." Those final months were both beautiful and heartbreaking. David taught me everything he could about running the garage, as if he expected me to take it over, even though we both knew I was meant for a different path. He told me stories about his childhood, about meeting my mother, about the day he first held me as a 3-year-old and decided he wanted to be my father. "You were so small," he said one afternoon as we sat on the front porch watching Emma play with the neighbor's dog, "and so angry. You kept asking for your mama, and when Sarah would leave the room, you'd cry like your heart was breaking. But gradually, you started trusting me, started calling me Daddy. That was the proudest moment of my life, Gabe, more proud than I was of anything else I ever did." As the cancer progressed, David became more reflective, more urgent about the things he wanted to say. One evening in late October, as the Texas heat finally began to break, he called me into his room. He was propped up in bed, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him, his once strong hands now thin and pale. "Gabe," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "there's something I need to give you." He reached into the drawer of his nightstand and pulled out a sealed manila envelope. My name was written on the front in his careful handwriting, along with the words, "Open when you're ready to know the truth." My heart started pounding. "David, what is this?" He pressed the envelope into my hands, his fingers trembling slightly. "It's about your biological father," he said. "Everything your mother couldn't tell you. Everything I promised I'd never reveal while she might get hurt by it." I stared at the envelope, feeling its weight. "What do you mean?" David closed his eyes, as if gathering strength. "Your mother made me promise to never tell you the truth about him. She was protecting you, Gabe, and protecting herself. But you're a man now, and when I'm gone—" He opened his eyes and looked directly at me. "When I'm gone, you'll have questions that no one else can answer. This envelope has those answers." "Can't you just tell me now?" He shook his head slowly. "I gave your mother my word, but after she's gone, after I'm gone, when you're ready to handle whatever's in there, that's when you'll know it's time." "What if I'm never ready?" David managed a weak smile. "You'll know when you are. And Gabe?" He squeezed my hand with what little strength he had left. "No matter what you learn, remember that you're the best thing that ever happened to me and your mother. Nothing in that envelope changes that." David passed away 3 days later, on a crisp November morning. I was holding his hand when he took his last breath, and I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The man who had been my anchor, my guide, my father in every way that mattered, was gone. The funeral was small but meaningful. David's friends from the garage, Mom's colleagues from school, neighbors who had known our family for years. Emma delivered a eulogy that had everyone in tears, talking about how David had taught her to be strong, to be kind, to never give up on the people you love. I spoke too, though I barely remember what I said. Something about how David had shown me what it meant to be a man, how he had chosen to love me when he didn't have to, how I would carry his lessons with me for the rest of my life. After the service, as we were cleaning out David's things, I found the envelope exactly where I'd left it in his nightstand drawer. Mom saw me holding it and went very still. "What's that?" she asked. though something in her voice suggested she already knew. "David gave it to me," I said carefully. "He said it was about my biological father." The color drained from Mom's face. "Gabriel, please. David promised me." "He said to open it when I was ready," I interrupted. "He said when you and he were both gone, I'd need answers." Mom sat down heavily on David's bed, looking older than her 58 years. "I'm not gone yet," she whispered. "Please, honey, don't open that. Not yet. Some truths are too painful to bear." Looking at her face, seeing the genuine fear in her eyes, I made a decision. I put the envelope in my jacket pocket and nodded. "Okay, Mom, when you're ready to tell me yourself, or when—" I couldn't finish the sentence. She understood. "Thank you," she said, relief flooding her features. "Thank you for giving me more time." That was 8 years ago. 8 years of carrying that envelope with me through 3 apartment moves, 2 job changes, and 1 failed engagement. Sarah, my ex-fiancée, had found it once while we were packing and asked about it. I'd given her some vague explanation about family documents, but the truth was, I was terrified of what I might find inside. Mom never brought up the subject again, and neither did I. We fell into a comfortable routine: Sunday dinners, holiday celebrations, phone calls every few days. Emma got married and had 2 kids, making Mom a grandmother who doted on her grandchildren with fierce joy. Life moved forward, as it always does, but the envelope was always there, a constant weight in whatever drawer or safe I kept it in. Sometimes I'd take it out and hold it, running my fingers over David's handwriting, wondering if today was the day I'd finally break the seal. But something always held me back. Fear, maybe, or loyalty to my mother's wishes. Or perhaps just the comfortable ignorance of not knowing. That changed last month. Mom had been complaining of headaches for weeks, dismissing them as stress from her job. But when she collapsed during a parent-teacher conference, the doctors found what they'd all been dreading: a brain tumor, aggressive and inoperable. The prognosis was grim. Weeks, maybe a couple of months. As I sat in that sterile hospital room watching my mother sleep with tubes and wires connecting her to various machines, I thought about David's words. When she's gone, when I'm gone, when you're ready to handle whatever's in there, that's when you'll know it's time. Mom passed away on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 31 years after David's diagnosis. Emma and I were both there, holding her hands as she slipped away peacefully in her sleep. Her last coherent words to me had been, "Take care of your sister. And Gabe, whatever you learn about the past, remember that you were loved. You were always loved." The funeral was larger than David's had been. Mom had touched so many lives during her 40 years of teaching. Former students, now adults with children of their own, came to pay their respects. They told stories of how she had believed in them when no one else did, how she had seen potential where others saw problems. A week after we buried Mom, I was alone in my Austin apartment, sitting at my kitchen table with the envelope in front of me. Emma had returned to her family in Dallas. The estate was settled, and for the first time in months, I had nothing to distract me from the questions that had haunted me for over 2 decades. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, David's brand, though I'd never been much of a drinker, and stared at the envelope. My hands were shaking as I reached for it. "Okay, David," I said aloud to the empty apartment. "I think I'm ready." I carefully opened the envelope, trying not to tear David's handwriting. Inside were several documents: a birth certificate I'd never seen before, a newspaper clipping yellowed with age, a letter in David's handwriting, and a photograph. I picked up the photograph first. It showed a young woman who was unmistakably my mother, maybe 19 or 20 years old, standing next to a tall man with dark hair and green eyes like mine. They were both smiling, but there was something in the man's smile that made me uncomfortable. It was too wide, too confident, like he owned whatever he was looking at. The birth certificate was mine, but it showed information I'd never known. Under father, it listed a name I'd never heard: Marcus Anthony Kellerman. The address was local, San Antonio, but it was the newspaper clipping that made my blood run cold. The headline read, "Local man sentenced to 15 years for domestic violence, assault." The article was dated about 6 months before my birth, and there, in the grainy black and white photo, was the same man from the photograph with my mother. According to the article, Marcus Kellerman had been convicted of aggravated assault against his girlfriend, who was pregnant at the time of the attack. The victim's name was withheld, but the details were horrifying. Kellerman had beaten her so severely that she'd been hospitalized for 3 weeks. He'd also been charged with assault against 2 police officers who had responded to the domestic violence call. My hands were trembling as I set down the clipping and picked up David's letter. His handwriting was shakier than usual, probably written during his final illness, but still legible. "Gabe, if you're reading this, then both your mother and I are gone, and you've decided you need to know the truth. I want you to know that this was the hardest secret I ever kept. But I promised Sarah I would never tell you while she was alive to be hurt by it. Your biological father, Marcus Kellerman, was a dangerous man. Sarah met him when she was 19, working as a waitress to pay for community college. He was charming at first, the way predators often are. He convinced her to move in with him, isolated her from her friends and family, and gradually became controlling and violent. When Sarah found out she was pregnant with you, she was terrified. Marcus had already hit her several times, and she knew it would get worse. She tried to leave him twice, but he found her both times and dragged her back. The second time, he beat her so badly that the neighbors called the police. That's when the assault happened that put him in prison. Sarah was 6 months pregnant with you, and he beat her with a baseball bat because she had talked to a male cashier at the grocery store. She almost lost you that night, Gabe. She spent 3 weeks in the hospital, and the doctors weren't sure either of you would survive. Marcus was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but he was released after 12 for good behavior. Sarah was terrified he would come looking for both of you, so she moved to a different part of town and changed her name back to her maiden name. That's when I met her. You were 3 years old and you had nightmares every night. You would wake up screaming, asking for your mama, terrified that the bad man was coming back. Sarah told me you had witnessed some of the violence, though she tried to shield you from most of it. I fell in love with both of you immediately. Sarah was broken but brave, and you were this fierce little boy who protected his mother even though you were barely more than a baby yourself. I knew I wanted to spend my life making sure both of you felt safe and loved. We married when you were 4, and I legally adopted you. Sarah made me promise that we would never tell you about Marcus unless it became absolutely necessary for your safety. She was terrified that knowing the truth would damage you, or that you might try to find him and put yourself in danger. Marcus was released from prison when you were 15. Sarah and I discussed whether to tell you then, but you were doing so well in school, so happy, that we decided to maintain the secret. We hired a private investigator to keep track of Marcus's whereabouts just to make sure he stayed away from our family. According to our last report, Marcus has been in and out of prison several times since his release. Assault, battery, drug charges, theft. He's currently serving time in the state penitentiary in Huntsville for armed robbery. He's not scheduled for release until 2029, when he'll be 68 years old. Gabe, I need you to understand something. You are nothing like him. I've watched you for 30 years and you have your mother's gentle heart and her strength. You've never raised your hand in anger, never hurt anyone weaker than yourself, never shown any of the cruelty that defined your biological father. The blood in your veins doesn't determine who you are. The choices you make, the love you give and receive, the way you treat other people, that's what makes you who you are. And by every measure that matters, you are a good man. I'm including Marcus's current information in case you ever decide you need to confront this part of your past, but I pray you won't feel that need. Some doors are better left unopened, some stones better left unturned. Whatever you decide, know that being your father was the greatest privilege of my life. You made me proud every single day, and I love you more than words can express. Your father always, David Morrison, P.S. There's one more thing. Sarah kept a journal during those dark years with Marcus, and during the early years of our marriage when she was healing. She made me promise to give it to you if something happened to both of us. It's in our safety deposit box at First National Bank. The key is taped under the top drawer of her jewelry box. She wanted you to understand her story in her own words, if you ever needed to. I set the letter down and just sat there for a long time, staring at the documents spread across my kitchen table. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about my mother's past, about my own origins, had been rewritten in the span of 20 minutes. My mother hadn't been a young woman who made a mistake with an irresponsible boyfriend. She had been a victim of domestic violence, a survivor who had protected me from a monster. David hadn't just fallen in love with a single mother. He had rescued both of us from a nightmare. And me? I wasn't the product of a casual relationship gone wrong. I was the son of a violent criminal, a man who had tried to kill my mother while she was pregnant with me. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I found myself doubled over at the kitchen table, struggling to breathe. All those years of wondering about my biological father, of romanticizing the idea that maybe he was out there somewhere thinking about me, wishing he could be part of my life. The truth was so much worse than anything I had imagined. But as the initial shock wore off, another emotion began to surface: profound gratitude. Gratitude for my mother's strength, for David's love, for the life they had built for me, far away from the violence and chaos of my earliest years. I thought about all the times David had looked at me with that strange expression, and now I understood what I had been seeing. It wasn't sadness or distance, it was fierce protectiveness. He had been watching for signs, making sure I never developed the darkness that lived in my biological father. I also understood now why my mother had been so adamant about keeping the truth hidden. She hadn't been protecting Marcus Kellerman's reputation or sparing his feelings. She had been protecting me from the knowledge that I carried the DNA of a man who had tried to murder us both. Over the next few days, I found myself obsessing over the details in David's letter. I researched Marcus Kellerman online and found a trail of arrests and convictions stretching back decades: assault, battery, domestic violence, drug possession, theft, armed robbery. The man was a career criminal with a particular talent for hurting women. I also found myself studying my own reflection, looking for signs of him in my features. The green eyes were definitely his, and maybe the shape of my jawline. But everything else, my height, my build, the way I carried myself, came from my mother's side of the family. More importantly, I realized that David had been right. I was nothing like Marcus Kellerman. I had never been in a fight that I didn't try to avoid first. I had never raised my voice to a woman, never felt the urge to control or intimidate someone weaker than myself. The darkness that defined my biological father had somehow skipped over me entirely. A week after reading David's letter, I drove to San Antonio and retrieved my mother's journal from the safety deposit box. It was a simple composition notebook, the kind students use in school, filled with my mother's careful handwriting. The early entries were heartbreaking. They documented the gradual escalation of Marcus's abuse, my mother's growing fear, her failed attempts to leave. She wrote about being pregnant and terrified, about lying awake at night wondering if her baby would survive if Marcus decided to beat her again. But the later entries, after she met David, told a different story. They were filled with wonder and gratitude, with descriptions of a man who treated her with kindness and respect. She wrote about watching David interact with me, about how patient he was with a traumatized 3-year-old who flinched every time a man raised his voice. One entry, dated about 6 months after she married David, particularly moved me. Gabriel called David Daddy for the first time today. David cried, actually cried, and I knew in that moment that we were finally safe. My son has a real father now, a man who will teach him how to be good and strong and gentle. Marcus will never touch our lives again. Another entry from when I was about 10 made me smile through my tears. Gabriel came home with a black eye today because he was defending a smaller kid from a bully. David was so proud, but he also sat Gabriel down and explained that violence should always be the last resort, that real strength comes from protecting people who can't protect themselves. I watched them together and marveled at how David has shaped my son into exactly the kind of man I always hoped he would become. Reading my mother's journal helped me understand the full scope of what David had done for our family. He hadn't just married a single mother. He had taken on the responsibility of healing 2 broken people, and creating a safe space where we could learn to trust and love again. As I processed all of this information, I found myself facing a decision. Marcus Kellerman was still alive, still in prison, but scheduled for release in a few years. Part of me was curious about him, wondered what he looked like now, whether he ever thought about the son he had never known. But a larger part of me realized that David had been right about some doors being better left unopened. Marcus Kellerman had contributed nothing to my life except DNA and trauma. He had no claim on me, no right to my time or attention or forgiveness. I was David Morrison's son in every way that mattered. I had his values, his work ethic, his capacity for love. I had learned from him how to be a man, how to treat people with respect, how to build something meaningful with your life. The truth about my biological father hadn't changed who I was. It had simply helped me appreciate more fully the man who had chosen to raise me. 3 months after reading David's letter, I made a decision that surprised even me. I sold my condo in Austin and moved back to San Antonio, taking a job with a local tech company that paid less, but offered something more valuable: the chance to be closer to the community where David and my mother had built their life together. I also made another decision. David's garage had been sitting empty since his death, and I decided to reopen it. Not as my full-time job. I still loved programming too much to give it up entirely, but as a weekend project, a way to honor David's memory and keep his legacy alive. Emma thought I was crazy. "You're a software engineer, not a mechanic," she pointed out during one of our phone calls. "What do you know about running a garage?" "David taught me more than you realize," I told her. "And it's not really about the cars. It's about having a place where people can come when they need help, where someone will treat them fairly and not try to take advantage of them." That's what David's garage was really about. The first few months were challenging. I had to relearn skills I hadn't used in years, had to build relationships with parts suppliers, and establish trust with customers who remembered David but weren't sure about his son. But gradually, word spread that Morrison's garage was back in business, and people started coming. Some of them were David's old customers, people who remembered him fondly and wanted to support his legacy. Others were new customers who had heard that we were honest and reliable. And a few were people who seemed to need more than just car repairs. They needed someone to listen, someone to treat them with respect and dignity. There was Maria, a single mother whose ex-husband had sabotaged her car to prevent her from getting to work. I fixed her car for free and helped her document the damage for the police report. There was James, a veteran with PTSD, who was having trouble finding steady work. I hired him part-time to help with basic maintenance tasks, and gradually he began to trust himself around people again. There was Linda, an elderly woman whose son was trying to convince her she was too old to drive. I gave her car a thorough safety inspection and helped her prove to her family that she was still capable of maintaining her independence. Each of these interactions reminded me of something David had always said: fixing cars is just the excuse. What we're really doing is helping people get their lives back on track. Working in the garage also gave me time to think about my own future. I was 34 years old, single, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I truly knew who I was. I wasn't running from my past anymore, wasn't haunted by questions about my origins. I was David Morrison's son, Sarah Morrison's son, and that was enough. One Saturday afternoon, as I was closing up the garage, a young woman came in with her car making terrible noises. She was clearly pregnant, maybe 7 months along, and she looked scared and overwhelmed. "I don't have much money," she said immediately, "but I need this car to get to work. My boyfriend left when he found out about the baby, and I'm trying to save up for when the baby comes." As I looked at her, young, alone, frightened but determined, I saw my mother at 19. I saw what she might have looked like if she had been brave enough to leave Marcus Kellerman before I was born, if she had been trying to build a life for herself and her unborn child. "Let me take a look," I said gently. "We'll figure something out." The car needed about $800 worth of work, money I knew she didn't have. But as I worked on it over the next few days, I found myself thinking about second chances, about the kindness of strangers, about the way one person's generosity can change the entire trajectory of someone's life. When I called to tell her the car was ready, I said, "The previous owner prepaid for all the maintenance on this car. You don't owe anything." It was a lie, of course, but it was the kind of lie David would have told, the kind of lie that makes the world a little bit better. She cried when she came to pick up the car, and she tried to insist on paying something, but I held firm. "Just pay it forward someday," I said. When you're in a position to help someone else, remember this moment. After she left, I sat in the garage thinking about the strange circularity of life. My mother had been saved by David's kindness, and now I was in a position to extend that same kindness to someone else. The cycle continued, the ripples spreading outward in ways we might never fully understand. That night, I called Emma and told her about my day. She listened quietly, and when I finished, she said, "You know, you sound just like Dad when you talk like that." "Which dad?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The only one who matters," she said. "David would be so proud of you, Gabe. Mom would be too." As I hung up the phone, I realized she was right. I had spent so many years worrying about the DNA I carried, about the violent man whose genes I shared. But DNA isn't destiny. The values we choose, the love we give and receive, the way we treat other people, that's what defines us. I am not Marcus Kellerman's son. I am David Morrison's son, Sarah Morrison's son, raised with love and kindness and the unshakable belief that everyone deserves a second chance. The envelope that had haunted me for 8 years had finally given me the answers I thought I needed. But more importantly, it had helped me understand that I already had everything that truly mattered. The knowledge that I was loved, the tools to build a meaningful life, and the opportunity to pass that love forward to others who needed it. Some truths are painful, but they can also be liberating. I know now where I came from, but more importantly, I know who I am and who I choose to be. And that, I think, is what David was trying to tell me all along. The truth didn't change me. It simply confirmed what David and my mother had spent 30 years teaching me, that love is stronger than blood, that kindness is more powerful than genetics, and that the family we choose is often more important than the family we're born into. I still have the envelope with all its documents and revelations, but it no longer haunts me. It's simply part of my story now, a chapter that explains how I got here, but doesn't dictate where I'm going. And where I'm going is forward, carrying David's lessons and my mother's love, trying every day to be worthy of the second chance they gave me, and looking for opportunities to give that same chance to others who need it. Because that's what family really means. Not the DNA we share, but the love we choose to give and the lives we choose to touch along the way.